Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Reality of Ransomware Preparedness. This is presented in partnership with our friends at HYCU. This is going to be a fantastic discussion between HYCU's founder and CEO, Mr. Simon Taylor, and our own Mr. Scott Lowe of ActualTech Media. Thanks so much for joining us on the webinar today. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about today's event. My name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the host of the event. As always, we want these events to be educational. We'll be taking your questions live there in the questions pane of your audience console. So I know you have questions about ransomware, ransomware prevention, ransomware recovery. This event is a fantastic opportunity for you to get all those questions answered. So we encourage you to use the questions box there in your audience console. We also have a number of resources I encourage you to check out there in the Handouts tab, including the just released State of Ransomware Preparedness report. This is published by ActualTech Media. This is where we've polled our audience. Perhaps one of you who are live here on the event participated in this survey, and it's got some really amazing results and statistics all around ransomware and ransomware recovery. So Simon and Scott will be discussing this survey and the results during the event today. We encourage you to download this report, share it with your friends and colleagues there in your IT organization. There in the Handouts tab, you'll also find a special report on the state of ransomware preparedness. This is how organization size impacts ransomware readiness. So this is where we take into account the size of the organization. I'm sure there's a very wide variety of companies on the call today, all the way from small one-man shops or SMBs up into mid-sized companies and then very large companies. And I'm confident that your state of ransomware readiness is going to vary greatly based on the size of your company. So we've got some great statistics in that report. And then the third and final report that you'll find there in the Handouts tab is the State of Ransomware Preparedness report based on the impact of board involvement. And I think that you'll find that one very fascinating as well. So make sure that you download all three of those reports before you go. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, check out the link right there at the top. It's for the HYCU Backup as a Service free trial. We encourage you to check out that link, sign up for the HYCU free trial. It's completely free for 14 days. Try it out for yourself. And I'm sure that you'll discover how simple data protection can be with HYCU and how HYCU can ensure that you are prepared should you be impacted by ransomware. And then finally, at the end of the webinar today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this event on demand, of course, that drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the Handouts tab. And then even better, we've got another gift card that we'll be awarding today based on your questions. It's the best question prize for an additional Amazon $50 gift card. Of course, that means you have to ask a question here on the live event, and of course, meet the ActualTech Media prize terms and conditions as well. We will review the questions after the event and select what we feel is the best question on the event and contact that prize winner with that Amazon $50 gift card. All right, and so with that housekeeping information out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to today's special guest, Mr. Simon Taylor, founder and CEO at HYCU, and our own Scott D. Lowe, CEO and partner at ActualTech Media. Scott, I'll hand it off to you. Take it away.
Thank you, David, for introducing us today. And again, thank you to Simon for joining us for this discussion about what's a really important topic for so many around the world, unfortunately, at this point, and that's ransomware. Simon, thank you for being here.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Scott. Great to see you again.
Now, I'm going to warn the audience ahead of time. You're going to see me looking all over the place. We have lots of charts, lots of graphs, lots of questions. And so I'm not going to be ignoring the camera, but I don't want you to think I'm being distracted by the cat in the corner. I'm just looking at some charts to get some good information. When we did this research, which we should probably tell the audience, HYCU commissioned ActualTech Media to run a survey about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And we just finished compiling the results. And they were pretty stunning in a lot of ways. Maybe not fully unexpected in some ways, because we all know ransomware is a scourge. But Simon, as you think about the research at a high level, did anything stand out to you that you're like, man, we need to dig more into this?
Yeah, I think, Scott, first of all, great to be here again with you. As you know, HYCU being the world's fastest growing backup as a service company, when we started to think about, how we could do more for our clients and our customers, one of the first things we thought was we need to educate the marketplace. So it was great partnering with you to sort of facilitate that research so that we could do exactly that. So we could put together real data from real marketplace participants so that we can then in turn educate the market on how to protect themselves more from the scourge of ransomware. And, I think if we go back to COVID, and I remember sitting in my little Vermont cabin, 2.5 years ago now, doing another session with you, and we were talking about ransomware and what we were seeing, everybody working from home, ransomware scourge taking off, criminality on the rise, became easier and easier to launch ransomware and execute ransomware attacks. And, we were saying, this is incredible, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. I really hope that this starts to elevate the discussion around recovery of data. And I think one of the things that the research really revealed that was incredible and really, really positive is that, and you'll have to remind me what the exact statistic was, but essentially when ransomware and data protection was elevated to the board level, those companies, those organizations were significantly more likely to be able to recover from a ransomware attack in less time and without spending money. And for me, that was it. It was once we elevate data protection from a second-class citizen to a first-class citizen where it ought to be in a world in which ransomware is so prevalent. I think what we're seeing is that when leaders take that role on and they take it seriously and they elevate that discussion to the board level, that's where we're seeing real protection and real gain.
Yeah, and that's the statistic that you're talking about. This was a stark difference. It's the question we asked was basically, how long will it take you to recover in the event of a ransomware issue that hits your organization? And we didn't ask any leading questions, but early on in the survey, we asked the question, is your board of directors involved in your ransomware preparedness strategy? And that was basically a yes or no. And when we then broke the data down, one of the answers for how long it takes to recover was a few hours. For organizations that don't involve their board of directors, 18% indicated that they can recover in a few hours business critical systems. For those that have their boards involved, 31%. That's a huge difference in being able to recover data. And it's not just involving your board necessarily. Like you just go to your board and say, we want you involved. That's not going to work. But if you actually, the way we look at this is that involving the board means that there's more of a culture of awareness in these organizations. And that's at least the way I looked at it. And what are your thoughts on that?
Scott, no, exactly right. And I think that's such an important point. It's not about your board helping you to recover from a ransomware attack. It's about bringing to the board's attention and preparing for that board meeting. It's actually, for me, it's about the preparation. Because if you as a leader of an organization are preparing for your board discussion, and you've got to have the facts and figures around recovery, you've got to have a process in place. We run a ransomware recovery score assessment, as you know, called getarscore.org. And very similar, what we found over and over again is the number one problem is people just don't have a plan. And so I think by elevating this to the board level, what it does is it becomes a forcing function, really, for executive leaders to come together and figure out what their plan is in the event of a ransomware attack, where they are gapped, and how they're going to resource for those gaps in an efficient way. And so again, to your point, that's that sort of evolution of culture around resiliency. And I think when we create a resilient culture, the proof is in the pudding. We see organizations far more likely to recover quickly from those attacks.
Yeah, and a big part of it is risk mitigation. Most boards of directors have some kind of a risk management group. And that's going to be the group naturally that takes care of this kind of stuff. So it becomes part of the overall risk management posture for the organization as well. So it's just the same as, unfortunately, insurance in some cases, but that was the way it's looked at. But people are willing to make those investments when they understand what's actually potential for disaster if they don't. And boards can make those decisions in concert with the executive team in a way that basically the single person managing this stuff can't.
You know, Scott, it brings to mind something that I heard that was really quite traumatic to hear. Just a few months ago, I did a presentation with the director of the FBI, Chris Wray, in consort with the Boston College cybersecurity program. And Director Wray got up right, before me. He was the headline speaker, and I was the follow-up. And the director talked about what I think is one of the biggest indictments against forgetting to focus on resiliency. And that was an incident that occurred at the Boston Children's Hospital here in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm sitting. And what had happened is the Iranian government decided to execute an attack. And Director Wray actually declassified this information because he understood that people are not aware of the problem. They're either not aware or they're burying their heads in the sand, and they're treating this almost like mental illness. It's sort of like, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to pretend it's not there. If I do get attacked, God forbid anybody finds out. And so we're all sort of pretending this isn't an issue. But what happened with the Boston Children's Hospital is the Iranian government tried to lock up children's operations files. So the children were actually going to be prevented from getting operated on. Now, I have a 9-year-old son. I know a lot of us have, children. And when we think about the horror, the sheer horror that created for the Boston Children's Hospital. Now, luckily, they were already partnered with the FBI on another initiative. The FBI swooped in, unlocked the data, and they were able to continue on with their day. But that could have been a tragedy of such immense proportions. And I think what it says to me is that this is not just a question of dollars and cents. There are people behind the data that are actually impacted in the real world when we don't take a strong look and a hard look at the impact of ransomware attacks. And so I think we've gone so far beyond, I couldn't reach my email accounts, and I might get embarrassed when somebody shares my financial data. What you need to think about as an organizational leader is, what is the data that you possess? What is it capable of doing? How can it be weaponized? And I think when we think about data not as just gold or something very positive, but as a truly weapon, as truly a weapon, I think it's in those cases where we really can see that ransomware is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society today, which means the ability to recover from those attacks has never been more important.
I mean, to your point about data being a weapon, part of the reason that it can be a weapon is because it's become so critical in so many ways in our society, not just, healthcare, but we've heard, about NHS in the UK a couple of years ago getting hit hard and people dying as a result of a ransomware attack. We heard about Colonial Pipeline shutting down, which impacted the Southeast United States for weeks. With gas lines as a result. So it has these attacks are not these sort of nefarious things that happen in the shadows anymore. They may be that, but they're creating front and center Main Street issues that people have to think about. And they're impacting a lot of organizations.
Well, you know why? It's because data has become so much more complex. We always talk about the fact that 10 years ago, the average company had about 6 different data sources. I think of it like a simple dice. And today, it's 150 different data silos per organization. So imagine you were building almost like a castle with 6 sides. You could theoretically put a guard in each side, but 150 different sides, it's indefensible. It's indefensible. Right. So you've got the rise of complexity on one side, and on the other side, you've got the simplicity with which it is possible to execute a ransomware attack. I was reading just the other day on the dark web now offers white glove ransomware as a service. White gloves, guys. For $150, you can, and I'm not recommending or supporting this, but what I would say is that for $150, it is possible to get a dark web organization to execute a ransomware attack as a service. So exponential increase in complexity from the perspective of the customer or the end user, and incredible simplicity for the criminals. And that is a perfect storm for danger. And that's why we've got to stop this. That's why we've got to do something about this.
We did some interviews with a white hat hacker who has been studying ransomware as a service, and I still can't believe it's a thing. But to your point, basically you basically contact these people, and they say, "What do you want?" And it's just like buying any other service. It's absolutely insane. I mean, we have some articles on that on ransomware.org as well. It's because it was just one of those things that's sort of mind-boggling, and it tells you how commoditized and dangerous this has become. In fact, we have a statistic that I want to share, and we'll have a chart on the screen here shortly. But 42 of our respondents, we asked the question: how many of you have experienced a ransomware attack? And the answer was: we have, we haven't, or we're not allowed to say. We stripped out the we're not allowed to says, and 42% of who was left said we have experienced a ransomware attack. I suspect that number is probably much higher, because if we hadn't stripped out the other ones, they probably can't say because they fell victim, right? In a lot of cases.
Well, Scott, that's the mental illness piece, right? I always think about this. My sister was a psychologist, and would always talk about the fact that people hide their mental illnesses because they are concerned about repercussions at work or from their own families. That's exactly where we are with ransomware attacks. People don't want to talk about it until they are forced to talk about it. And because of that, we don't really know the numbers. People are afraid to discuss it. But I will tell you, I think it's much more prevalent than we even know, much more prevalent.
Agreed.
And we know that because there's a new ransomware attack executed every 11 seconds. Every 11 seconds.
11 seconds. Wow. I didn't know that. That's stunning. One of the things people say is, okay, well, I do backups, so I'm fine. We're going to dig into that. We actually have some questions from the audience I'm going to ask in just a second. But one of these statistics that jumped out at me during this study was this. One of the questions we asked was, did your organization experience any of the following? We listed a bunch of things. And these were only for people who actually fell victim to a ransomware attack. One of the things that we had on that list was we experienced some level of irrevocable data loss. Irretrievable data. We couldn't get it back. 52%, more than half of people who fell victim to a ransomware attack had data they could not get back. It was gone forever. And we actually have a couple of questions on this, and I think it's going to be a good time to talk a little bit about what HYCU brings to the table too. But one of the questions...
Sorry, Scott, before we get to that, I want to comment on that 52% because it shocks me to the core, and yet it doesn't surprise me. It constantly shocks me to hear those numbers, and yet I'm no longer surprised because I see it every day. I think that one of the biggest misnomers today, and it's the same misnomer that existed 2 years ago when we spoke, unfortunately, is people still believe that their cloud and SaaS data is automatically protected. Yes. And I think if there's one thing that everybody should get out of this webinar, it's go read up on the shared responsibility model that is leveraged by every single hyperscaler, which very clearly states, and it's in different paragraphs in all of your hyperscaler contracts, whether it's Google, Azure, or AWS, they provide the infrastructure, you protect the data. It's not on them. It's not on them. So often what we hear is, well, we don't really think about backing up our cloud. I think the SaaS vendor probably has that. Well, did you ask the question, where is it backed up? Do you get to choose where that data is backed up? Or is it just, is it sort of happening somewhere inside of your EULA? I think understanding how our data is being protected, regardless of what that source might be. So regardless of where the data sits in production, you should have the control and the ability to protect your data, no matter where it starts.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, we have some questions around this. So this is one of the questions that I think it speaks perfectly to what you just said. This is from Ted Masson. We recently completed an internal penetration test and confirmed that our OneDrive files are at risk. Are there any Microsoft products to help prevent notifying a ransomware attempt, or are third-party solutions a better option? And you just answered that. I mean, Microsoft doesn't do it. They may have some add-on somewhere that helps, but it's still not addressing it. How does HYCU help those kind of organizations that are struggling with, what do I do with this cloud data? Because my traditional backup doesn't do anything with it.
So HYCU, again, one of the fastest growing backup as a service vendors worldwide. We've got about 3,200 customers in 76 countries. Our platform is called HYCU Protege, and it is truly, I would say, one of the world's only true multi-cloud backup as a service platforms. And one of the things we've done is, rather than building sort of a box or an appliance for one specific data source and then sort of evolving it to work with everything else, we took an entirely different approach. We said customers are going to have data on-prem, they're going to have data in public cloud, and they're going to have data in SaaS. And so what we did is we built purpose-built backup services that are native to each one of those different sources. So the best way to think about protecting, to Ted's question, Office 365, is you need to make sure that your data protection vendor actually has a true hosted solution or non-hosted solution that can protect and back up every element of O365, or now M365. I think a lot of times what people do is they try to think of Office 365 in the same genre as Microsoft Exchange. This is not Exchange. This is a hosted solution. You need to be able to back up all of the bits and bytes, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's OneNote, whether it's all of your Office products. And I think if you don't have a purpose-built service that can do that, ultimately that's a massive gap for you and your organization. I'm not going to say that we're the only one. There are many companies out there that do back up and protect Office 365. But I think the challenge goes beyond just backing up that one particular product. The real problem is you've got data in hundreds of different places. Mm-hmm. Ted, I don't know your organization, but I can guarantee you that there's over 50 different data sources in your organization, places where your data is sitting. The challenge becomes, are you going to have 50 different screens to monitor and manage and protect all of those different data sources? If you do, that's 50 different resources you need to hire to protect the data. I think the best thing about HYCU is that we bring all of that data, we up-level it under a single pane of glass, and we allow you to monitor and manage all of that data without any additional resources required. So again, it's that purpose-built backup as a service. It's the ability to gain visibility into where your data is, and it's the ability to view all of your data sources under a single pane of glass. I think when we do those things, we protect our organizations. And when we monitor them in real time and really understand what policies we're using to protect the data, that's how we get up and running again when there's a data breach or when there's a ransomware attack.
To your point, there was a question we asked in the survey, and this is the one question I think that we do not have accurate results. And I shouldn't say that, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I think that people are thinking about what their perception of their SaaS tools is. And the question we asked, this was for people who indicated they are running cloud workloads. Do you back up all or some of your cloud-based workloads? 40% said all. That's there's no way. I think they were thinking about what they think their providers are doing the backups. And I wish we'd asked a follow-on question for that, but we didn't. But people are overestimating what's happening with their providers, to your point. And I think that's really important for people to understand.
So I think, Scott, when you think about what the cloud provider wants you to do, and look, we love our cloud partners, all three of them. Yeah, but I will say this, the hyperscaler ultimately wants your data to not only be lifted and shifted to their cloud, they then want it to be translated and repositioned into one of their own cloud services. So let's say you're running SQL on-prem. Well, Google's ultimate goal is to get you to use Cloud SQL. Now, Cloud SQL is an amazing, amazing service, so there's no reason not to use it. But I think what happens, to your point, is that when people think about, is my data protected? They know it's protected on-prem. They might know that the initial lift and shift is protected. I would still argue it's probably less than 40%, but let's assume that 40% of people are doing that. I think where we lose them, though, is then they move to that cloud service and it's not protected. And because they've checked that initial box when it was on-prem, they assume that it's protected again when it moves to Cloud SQL. And the question we need to be asking ourselves is that SaaS service protected as well? Is it protected all the way through that entire transformation or just to the beginning of the process? And if it's not, then we're ultimately becoming less safe and less resilient the deeper we get.
That's a really good point. I hadn't considered the on-prem versus native cloud transition impacting how people think about whether they're protected or not. But that's really insightful and something that probably a lot of people are not thinking about.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's talk about just overall preparedness for a second. And the question is around spend. Now, obviously, when we start thinking about spending money, people don't want to. But we are seeing significant increase in spending for ransomware preparedness. And we broke it up into 3 buckets: detection, prevention, and recovery. And in those areas, only 7%, 4%, and 6% respectively are reducing spend in those 3 categories. And so, 7% less on detection, 4% less on prevention, 6% on recovery. But the other side of the fence is 39% of people are increasing their spend on detection, 46% on recovery and prevention as well. That's a significant increase in spend.
And what was the increase on recovery?
46% as well.
Good.
So people are spending more.
Well, and that's a positive surprise, to be honest, because I think one of the things we've been trumpeting for the last couple of years, as you know, Scott, is when you think about PDR, prevention and detection tend to become the golden child, right? That's the place where everyone looks first. And the way I'd like the audience to sort of think about this, picture you're in your castle, your 150 different sided castle, which is incredibly hard to defend. A lot of us have this natural instinct that we're gonna build the walls higher and we're gonna dig the moat deeper to keep the bad actors out. And the reality is there are so many more of them than there are of you that at some point those walls are going to get breached. And the P and the D, the prevention and detection, will not help you once they're inside the walls. And that's why we always say, focus on your recovery. It's not if, it's when. It's going to happen. Make sure you can recover from those attacks and you can be protected even when they breach the walls.
Let's go back to the board involvement for a second, because there's another stark statistic here on the spending figures, you may guess. For organizations where they have their boards involved, 43% are increasing their spend. 53% are increasing their spend on the recovery aspect as compared to 37% where their boards are not involved. So again, we see results when boards are involved. And it doesn't mean just because you spend more money, you're getting results. We're also seeing it translating down into what their expectations are for recovery. But these, obviously, in this case, you need to spend money to not lose money. I mean, it's really what it boils down to at some point, right? And that's the piece that I think is really key here in terms of board involvement, in terms of the spending piece. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I would go back to what I was just saying. I think one of the challenges is there are thousands and thousands of cybersecurity solutions out there today. And they are all, the pitch is always the same, right? Be afraid. People are coming in the doors. You need stronger doors. We can help you keep the bad guys out. And so I think we've got to change that thinking. I think what we've got to say is there's a crisis out there, right? My data is my most valuable asset, but it can be weaponized against me. And the only way for me to really protect myself is to make sure that when I'm making these investments, I'm looking at a worst case scenario. Don't just look at a scenario in which you save the day and are the hero. Because if you do that, you're going to end up focusing most of your budget, most of your time, most of your effort standing up taller walls. I think what we need to do is say, when I'm hit and when I get that call at 2 a.m. and somebody says, we've been breached, how bad of a day are you going to have, right? Are you going to have a bad day in the sense that, it's going to be a lot of work, we're going to get back up and running and we'll be okay? Or are you sitting with your board 3 weeks later saying, yes, this was crippling for my organization and we didn't have a plan and we were not able to recover the data? Again, that statistic, that so many people have actually lost data and it's been unrecoverable. And I think what we need to start thinking about is, when we invest in resiliency, when we invest in the ability to recover, what are we actually investing in? And I think there's a lot of conversations about where that money should be going and what it should be doing. But I would argue, and this is not a self-serving comment, this is actually to my commercial detriment, but I'll tell you, a lot of that money should be spent on internal processes. Build a really strong resiliency plan, know what you're going to do. Have your cyber attorney ready to go. Have your contact at the FBI, your package ready to go. The faster you can spin up a package upon being attacked, the faster the FBI can get to work helping you. They can't help you unless you know what to prepare. You have everything prepared and you're ready to hit send. That's part one. And then part two is on the recovery side. You need to understand what policies you have in place, where you're protected, where you're most vulnerable. And you need to be constantly addressing those gaps. And so I think what a lot of people do is they don't spend the time to heat map out. They don't create that sort of treasure map that actually tells them where all of their vulnerabilities are. And so when this happens, they suddenly say, oh my gosh, they got it. They got the data. We can't get it back. Now what do we do? That can create weeks and weeks and weeks of downtime for your organization and seriously be to the detriment of your customers, your partners, and certainly your employees as well.
Absolutely. We have some more questions from the audience. A couple of these are very tactical, so we're going to kind of move from the strategic to getting in the weeds a little bit. The first question is from Michael, and he asks, a lot of cloud backup services claim they are air gapped, which, as we all know, in terms of backup recovery, is super important for on-premises, but also as well as cloud. The question is, what should we look for in a service that's to be truly air gapped? Because some say they are, but they're not really.
Yeah. So look, the true, if you go beyond the marketing, right? You go beyond the sales pitches. What is true air gapping, right? True air gapping is there's no network connectivity. You've got a server locked, in a vault somewhere and nobody can get to it. You've got one key, only you can get to it. You go in. I mean, it's literally, how you store the nuclear codes kind of stuff.
Right.
The reality is that it's inconceivable in a multi-cloud world that we're going to do that. The data is in far too many places. You don't have that level of control, but you need that level of security. And so I think rather than focusing on just what air gapping is and what we call virtual air gapping, which is an incredible way of using multi-tenancy and being able to shield your data and compartmentalize it so it's much more protected, all of that is incredibly important. And of course, HYCU does that. But the real stopper from a ransomware attack is to use write once, read many, worm on immutable storage. What you need to make sure really happens is that when the bad actors get in, if they do, and they're able to circumvent some of these virtual air gapping methodologies, you need to be able to say, they weren't able to write over anything that I did, right? We wrote it once, it's still there. They can't corrupt my backups. That's the name of the game. We've seen a lot of vendors have challenges with this. And so again, immutable storage with worm, that is the single most important thing you can do. And then on top of that, of course, you want multi-factor authentication. You want to protect your passwords. And you need an amazing amount of process, again, around how locked down all of those details are. Because again, vendors like us can do so much. If you give your password out to everybody, it becomes a real problem. So lock down your passwords, use multi-factor authentication, and make sure that your recovery plan includes worm with immutable storage. That is the single best way to ensure that nobody can corrupt those important backups for you.
The next question is one that's semi-related, and I think it goes back to really keeping things simple, helping people understand at a high level what some of these things mean. And the question is, I think that there's this perception that if I encrypt all my stuff myself, then it can't be encrypted again. And the question is, if all my files are already encrypted, I think the person's indicating that means they're already protected, but is really a misnomer. They're protected in certain ways, but not from ransomware. Can ransomware encrypt them again? The answer is yes.
Yes.
And then you just it's an encrypted file is still a file.
That's right. It's still a file. And I think there's something else here, which is one of the things you need to be able to do is you actually need to be able to set up alerts and monitoring so that you know when something like that is actually happening inside your environment. And I think one of the things that we see a lot is people focus on, they run a backup, they set it and forget it. We've made it very, very easy to do that. But you need to be running tests. You need to actually be trying to recover workloads, making sure that they are not in any way disjointed, that there's no issues with those recoveries. I need to be doing that on a very regular basis. Testing full recovery situations, just like you would do a fire drill. I mean, think of it like that. You've got to go through that kind of rigor within your organization to make sure that this works. I was speaking to somebody recently, and they said, look, we do an enormous amount of work to make sure that folks don't just click on phishing emails. And I said, what do you do?
Yeah.
He said, well, we send everybody in the company an email that says, click here for free Bitcoin, and 3 strikes and you're out. And so again, there's all different levels to which you can make sure that your organization is becoming more resilient. But I think one of the most important things that we all need to do is really understand that, yes, your data can be encrypted twice. Yes, the bad actors can come in and take control of it. And it is up to you to make sure that you're constantly trying those backup and recovery processes to ensure that they're working properly.
One mistake I've seen organizations make in testing their backup and recovery process is they test them in a silo. IT tests recovery. Great, it worked. They fail the larger tabletop exercise type test, which is really, really important. I remember, this is not necessarily ransomware related, it was more natural disaster related. We were doing a tabletop recovery exercise in an organization, and somebody said, and then we're going to call so-and-so. And I said, you're going to call them with what? Cell phone towers are down. We'll call them from our desk phones. There are no desk phones. Like, just people don't think about, I mean,
That's right.
We didn't have a generator right at the time. So it was all battery, and they only lasted half an hour. And so people don't think about where they have critical path items in the way of recovery. So getting broader testing in place beyond just IT making sure the backups are recoverable is important.
And Scott, this brings it full circle back to the board, right? Because one of the challenges that we see time and time again is that leaders in organizations will say, I just don't have time to do all this. I've got so many other priorities. Yes, I know how important this is. Gosh, I hope that doesn't happen. We're going to get to this. Well, if your board is informed and your board takes a role in saying this is priority number one, this is actually mission critical, the company will go down if we don't do this. It gives the leaders of these organizations a lot more freedom to invest the time it takes to run those tabletop exercises the right way, identify the gaps, and then spend the time and resources to actually fill those gaps with efficient and better processes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Another question. This is going to go back to sort of the air gapping question a little bit, but how do you ensure that your backups have not been compromised by ransomware? We've all heard the horror stories, right? That ransomware got the backups, or you recover and there was ransomware in the backups.
Yes. I mean, look, I think it goes back to what we were saying before, right? You need to be able to track things like abnormal change rates in the process. You need to be able to understand if there are abnormalities in the way that the data is actually functioning. And the only way to do that is to run those tests. You need to set your policies, and then, once every period, maybe once every couple of weeks, maybe once every month, you need to actually go through that full process of trying to recover your data, full workloads, end to end, and then running them in production environments. It's only when you go through that full process that you're actually going to be able to fix this. Now, you also need to make sure that your data protection vendor is monitoring for things like this. If there's an abnormality, you want it to be flagged immediately in your system. HYCU does all of that, and that's great. And, I would argue that HYCU is probably the best in the industry at doing it. But it doesn't change the fact that if you're not running these tests yourself, if you're not running the tabletop exercises, and if you're not running full recoveries and looking for these abnormalities, you're still going to miss it. You're still going to create gaps in the process that a ransomware attack can get right through. So it's a combination of you having the internal process and having the right data protection vendor to be able to identify all of those abnormalities. When we bring those two pieces of the pie together, that's when we get a lot safer and a lot more resilient.
Let's go back to some data for a minute. Sure. Some of the other things that jumped out during this research were the organization size playing a role in some ways for ransomware preparedness outcomes and stuff like that. Some of this may have to do with just the maturity of those organizations. In fact, as I'm looking at the data, you know, okay, let's go back to who's been hit with ransomware. Larger organizations are more at risk for ransomware. There's a bigger payoff. We talked about anything as a service. There's economics at play, and so even ransomware actors that are off buying services to get it, for attacks, there's a bigger footprint for larger organizations. Do you see that in what you're doing at HYCU as well? That large organizations are more at risk?
I'm going to make a controversial comment here, but I think it's very true. American organizations are more at risk. Large American organizations, and there's a simple reason for it. The attackers know that cyber insurance is more prevalent in the United States. And while we fully believe that you should have cyber insurance coverage, do not misread me or mishear me here. You must have cyber insurance. But the challenge is they know they're going to get paid. And it's that forethought around we're going to get paid. We're going to get paid a lot. And if it's an American company, they're more likely to have cyber insurance that will make the payout. That's where you get this incessant level of attacks. And again, it brings up, which is, I'm sure, the next question on the list, another very critical point, which is, if I get attacked, do I pay? Right?
That is one of the questions we have, actually, yeah.
and just to jump ahead to that a little bit, it's probably one of the hardest things. It's almost like, when people say don't give financial advice unless you're a financial advisor, the FBI will tell you don't pay, because systemically, the more often these bad actors are paid, you're really adding to the problem. The challenge is, of course, on an individual basis, if God forbid, there is a bad actor who's holding hostage data that's going to be used in operating rooms, for example, and you can pay it and get them back or let people die. This is one of the most case-by-case sort of situations I can think of. And again, I think the answer to it is, of course, to know what you're going to do. And there are vendors out there that can help you to do these things. And you should certainly have cyber insurance. But the best thing you can do is have your data safe and recoverable. Because if you can recover your data, it gives you optionality. And without that optionality, you are truly at the mercy of these criminals. And I think that's the sort of name of the game here, is give yourself the ability to choose. And if you don't have access to recovered data, you can't choose. That choice has been taken from you.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I've never liked the absolutes that we hear from like the FBI. You should never pay the ransom. It's not that simple, to your point. Everything is situational. And I was going to actually the example that jumped in my head was the children's hospital. You're not going to let a bunch of kids die because you didn't want to send some money to a bunch of criminals. It's just not, it would be inhumane.
That's right. Thank God the FBI was already linked in with them. But the reality is we don't all have that connection.
Right.
There are only so many FBI offices. There are only so many FBI case officers. There are only so many folks who can support the hundreds of thousands of attacks that are occurring every year. And so I think it is going to be very case by case. But the number one thing you need to consider is just, how much of my data can I get back? Can I get 100% recovered? Can I ensure that it's not corrupted? Can I ensure they haven't corrupted all my backups? And how quickly can I access it? And I think when you have all those components, that's when you can have a real decision. You can really sit down and say, we've already got our data back, but they've got it too. What should we do, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's how you change the game here. You don't change the game just by deciding in advance, we're never going to do that or we're always going to do that. I think it's very situational, and it's incredibly important for your organization, your customers, your partners, users of your products and services, that you really take a long, hard look and give yourself that optionality.
One of the things that's interesting here is that smaller organizations tend to perform worse than larger ones. They're not getting attacked as much, but in terms of actual outcomes, it seems like they're having a harder time. But they don't have the resources. And that was borne out in the research. They're spending less. They're not increasing their spending at the rate of their bigger brethren, and their boards are not as involved. So not all small organizations have boards, so we took those out of the results. But in this case, for companies that are 250 and under, 42% do not involve their boards in this kind of planning. So there's an element of not getting buy-in from the top as well that's probably playing into some of this.
This is a really interesting one. And again, a slightly controversial comment here. But I think a lot of it starts from this perspective. Small companies don't have the resources and can't have the resources by nature of their size to really combat this. So we need to think a little bit more tangentially about other steps we can take to be successful. One of the things that, Bain Capital Ventures does, obviously an investor in HYCU, does really well is they provide a lot of services to their portfolio companies that support this kind of cybersecurity. Now, not everybody is venture backed. Not everybody has a Bain Capital to turn to. But I do think that there is more and more of a need for investors and large scale, portfolio managers to start looking at ways that they can support these portfolio companies. I think there's a moral and a commercial imperative to do so. And I think that, individual portfolio companies should be reaching out to their investors to ask those kinds of questions, whether it's to get better deals on cybersecurity insurance, whether it's to get references, whether it's to speak to CISOs and try to understand how they can do a better job. The other thing I would say is if you are a small company, don't try to go it alone. There's a lot of great organizations out there now that will effectively be almost your CISO for hire. And whether it's a CISO for hire or whether it's an MSP, a managed service provider that's going to offer those same level of services, spend time investing in that. Don't think that you're going to, as a company with 50 people, going to be able to create the same level of resiliency that an organization with 10,000 people is going to have. You're never going to be able to put that kind of money into it. But there are service providers out there who have the capability to do that. Make sure you're having those conversations and make sure you find the right one, not just the guy that sells you servers. You need to find an organization that actually has a true core competency in this area and can really guide you through that process and help you to put the policies in place to stay safe and stay resilient.
I've been a big fan of dedicated CISO firms versus using MSPs that have a profit motive to sell you more stuff. And it's not that I'm that cynical, but at the same time, I kind of like keeping it. This is about security. It's not about buying a bunch of stuff. And
I think that's right. I think that's right. One of the mistakes people make is, this is the person who always sold me my Dell gear, and so now I'm going to use them as my CISO. I think that's a mistake. But I would say that there are a lot of new fractional organizations now that are taking a more comprehensive look at sort of the entire ecosystem of cybersecurity. And I think some of those folks will not just sell you, they'll actually want you to stay resilient and up and running. So spend the time, if you are going to use a service provider, speak to their references, understand, what it is you're getting. This is not a pay-to-play situation. You need somebody with wisdom and knowledge to help your organization to stay safe.
Speaking of time, when we talked about people about how much time they spend each week on ransomware preparedness, in general, 70% are spending 5 hours or less. Now, this is an individual, not an organization. So that person is spending that much time on ransomware preparedness. But when we talk about organization size, one of the statistics we asked, forget the size report for a second, was one of the questions we asked early on, as you may recall, was, have you ever experienced an attack? And we decided that on this question, we wanted to try to understand, if you've experienced an attack, do you spend more or less time on preparedness now? And what comes as no surprise, those who have experienced an attack before are much more likely to spend more time on preparedness individually than those that never experience an attack, because they know what's going to happen. The more time to spend on preparation, the less time to spend on recovery.
It makes complete sense. It makes complete sense, right? But I think one of the things we need to do as an industry is start spending more time. When I say the industry, data protection industry, we need to start spending more time on true education, not fear mongering just to sell product, but actually looking at providing real, helpful, useful information to customers, partners, prospects in the industry at large to help stop this scourge. It's a war. And it's a very, very dangerous one. I gave a presentation about a year ago on data as the new ammunition. And it's true, data has been weaponized. And I think the more that we can get our heads around the fact that every piece of data in your organization is now a weapon, that wasn't the case 20 years ago. CIOs 20 years ago weren't thinking about when somebody takes their data and turns it against them. What they were thinking about is how fast, how cheap, et cetera, et cetera. These were just simple commercial terms. Today, data is something else entirely. And I think I hear so many of my colleagues in the industry talk about data as the new gold or the new oil. And the reality is it's just a weapon. It's a weapon. It's been weaponized so completely at this point that we need to handle it with care. We need to take care of it. We need to protect it. And we need to understand that it's going to grow. It's going to become more disparate. And we've got to find ways to flatten that into one level attack surface so that we can protect ourselves and our companies.
So this kind of ties into a theme that we've talked about throughout this presentation, which is sort of it takes a village in some ways. It's not just the data protection person that has to take all this on their shoulders. And this question comes from Cheryl. It's depending on the scale of the company, what teams or players should be involved in ransomware preparedness? What are your thoughts on that?
As a data protection guy, I want to say all teams. But I think here's the way I would think about it. I think you need to have every C-level executive in the organization aware of what's going on. Okay, so in terms of think about it, inputs and outputs. The inputs need to come from the CIO, the CISO, their various teams within IT organizations. They need to then be discussed with the different business units and business owners, and then presented at the board level. But I think beyond that, there needs to actually be touch points with every single employee in the organization. So go back to my email phishing test. I think we've got to find ways to kind of gamify data protection. We need to find ways to engage everyone in an organization. True story. When we revised our multi-factor authentication policy here at HYCU, I got up and did an all hands about it. And people said, why is the CEO spending all this time talking about MFA? I said, because it leads to so many other massive problems. And I want people every time, they sort of go through those gates, I want them to think, my data just got safer. I just got safer. My job just got safer. My company just got safer. All of my colleagues just got safer. I think once we start to create that cultural attachment to being resilient, I think that's actually how we protect our organizations.
There was another question here that was really interesting, and it kind of goes along with what we talked about. And I've heard this from others too, is they're frustrated that they can't get buy-in. Now we know that involving the board can help you unlock dollars and unlock resources, but what is the best way for an individual contributor that knows this is a problem in their organizations to make people aware? So the question is, what's the best way to sell investment dollars going to ransomware preparedness to management in general? Because again, to the point we've made, everybody's busy, everybody's got things on their plates, and that's something that might happen. It's not a guarantee, so we're just going to ignore it for now, and then it happens and they have a serious problem. How do people help their organizations make that leap?
The first thing that comes to mind is call the FBI. And it's a funny thing, but the reality is, we as business leaders are not very used to having the FBI walk into our office. If you can get your senior leadership to take a visit down with the FBI, speak with an agent, have an agent come into the office, it's going to become very clear very quickly that your organization is not doing the right thing. It's very different having somebody, hold up a bunch of analyst reports and saying, look at all these numbers, to this is the special agent in charge of cybersecurity, and he doesn't think we're doing everything we should be, right? So that's one sort of creative approach to sort of going after this problem. But the other thing I would say is, at this point, if you sit with your CEO or your senior leadership and say, we are not protected from ransomware attacks, we're not going to be able to recover our data. Now, it's another thing entirely if the argument is we haven't built the walls high enough, we haven't built the moat deep enough, there's 7 other tools. Tool spread is a challenge for every organization. Right. There's no CEO I know that doesn't face that problem, and you're going to hear no sometimes. But if the question is, or the problem statement is, we are not able to recover our data in the event of a ransomware attack. If somebody in your organization tells you, I don't care, that's not a real problem, you might be in the wrong company. Because fundamentally,
update your resume.
Yeah, exactly. It is at this point such table stakes that we can recover our data. And again, this has gone beyond, I think, a commercial imperative. It's now a moral imperative. We must protect the people behind the data. I feel very, very strongly about that, Scott, as I know you do. And certainly, if you need somebody to help you make your case, you can always give me a call. I'm happy to jump on the phone, because ultimately, I think this is one of the world's greatest problems, and we need to work together to solve it.
This is the last question we take from the audience, but it's actually not staged. I want to make that clear. The question is basically, is there a community version or a free trial so I can try HYCU out?
There absolutely is. Go to www.tryhycu.com, tryhycu.com, and you can both get a free tier version of our product, or you can get a free trial for the complete version as well.
We should also remind the audience there's 3 reports available in the handout section. Here you can learn about the results of the research that we did with HYCU. And see for yourself exactly sort of a lot more than we talked about today. There's a lot of really good information in these reports. I was really, like I said, a couple times I looked at the data and was sort of like, wow, this is really standing out to me. And so that's really interesting. I also like to, can you just give us the 30,000 foot overview of Get Our Score? Because I think that's important for people to understand.
Absolutely. One of the things, going back to this moral imperative concept, we realize that, as a data protection company, we're going out there saying everyone needs to care about this. There's a real gap. There's a real market. But the answer a lot of times was, but you're selling us something. And we said, you know what? You're right. So we invented getourscore.org as a completely free public service. And what it does is it assesses online, very, very simply, your ability to recover from a ransomware attack. And at the end, it gives you a score, 0 to 1,000, just like a credit score, but it also gives you a set of custom recommendations on how you can improve your R score and how you can improve your ability to recover. We don't ask for any data from you. We don't gate any content. It is 100% free. And the reason we do that is because we don't ever want our score to become a source of data that criminals could attack. This is a very, very true and honest public service that we've designed because we want this marketplace to get better. We want this marketplace to become more resilient. And we want this marketplace to be able to fight back against the scourge of ransomware. So again, just go to www.getourscore.org, R like the letter R, score.org. We partnered with amazing folks to build this out. Kevin Mandian from Mandian. We partnered with Tony Safoyan over at SADA, Craig Abode over at Carasoft, because what started to happen is people started seeing us do this, and they said, my customers need this as well. How do I become a part of this? And we really started to build out this nice community of folks who all have that same belief, which is that we have a moral imperative to fix the scourge of ransomware. So check it out. I think we've had about 60,000 folks take the test, get results, and hopefully get the help that they need. You can also always contact, HYCU directly, and we're always happy to walk you through the test itself.
Simon, this has been a fantastic discussion today. I really appreciate your time on this, and thank you again for working with us on this research. It was really intriguing.
Scott, and I'll say this, I've said this before, I'll say it again, ActualTech Media, you guys do an incredible job. Thank you so much for spearheading this effort with us.
And with that, I'm going to thank our audience, and I'm going to turn it back over to David.
Wow, what an excellent discussion. I learned so much on today's event. I do want to remind everyone to make sure that you check out the handouts there in your audience console in the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find the 3 different state of ransomware preparedness reports commissioned by HYCU and created by ActualTech Media. I encourage you to download these reports before we wrap up today's event because they won't be as readily accessible after the event. And then finally, make sure that you click on that link there on the top to check out the HYCU free trial. This is where you can try out the HYCU data protection and ransomware recovery solution for 14 days completely free. Thank you so much to our friends at HYCU for supporting us on today's event. And of course, thank you to our audience for all of your excellent questions. It's now my pleasure to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. This is going out to Rushi Gautam from Kansas. Congratulations. We'll reach out to you to deliver that gift card, and we'll also be reaching out to our best question prize winner after the event. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.